good morning. Thank you for being here on a Saturday morning. It's a pleasure for me to chair this roundtable on a very topical issue with a fantastic panel, I would say. So I'm very grateful also to the speakers for having accepted to participate on a Saturday morning. And without taking much time, I don't need, I think, to explain how relevant the topic is, how important what we are going to discuss is nowadays. It's under our eyes every day, every morning. We are warned about something else that has happened in the Gaza Strip and beyond that. So without taking any more time, I wish to introduce the speakers, and then I will give the floor one by one to them, following a question that I will pose. The first speaker is Professor Raffaella del Sarto. Raffaella del Sarto is professor of the Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins University, particularly at the School of Advanced Studies Bologna campus. And she's also visiting fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. She's an expert on the Middle East and North Africa. In particular, she's expert on relations with Europe, but also she has published widely, and I think it's the most recent book of her, a book on Israel foreign and domestic policy. And the question of the link between internal and external is at the core of her research. She has worked also on very interesting topic of borders, and in particular, I wish to mention a book that I like particularly, Borderlands, Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East, with Oxford University Press in 2021. And the other book I was mentioning before is called Israel Under Siege, The Politics of Insecurity and the Rise of Israeli Neo-Revisionist Right, Georgetown University, 2017. The second speaker is Andrea Teti, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Salerno. He's also an expert on the Middle East and Middle East relations. He has published on democratization, Egyptian politics, continental political theory, and knowledge production in the Middle East in the area of social sciences. He has co-authored Democratization Against Democracy, How the EU Policy Fails in the Middle East, Palgrave 2020, and he has authored the book The Arab Uprising in Tunisia, Egypt and Jordan, Springer 2018. Of course, those are only a very small selection of all the publications these speakers have produced. Daniela Huber. She is a researcher at the Roma 3 University. I have no idea how it would sound in English. It's the third university in Rome. She's also a scientific advisor to the Mediterranean, Middle East and Africa program at the Institute of International Affairs. And I wish to mention this because she has done it for a long time. And she's also in this with her affiliation to the Institute of International Affairs, the co-editor of the International Spectator. She is as well an expert on the Middle East. In particular, she has worked on relations between the European Union, the US, and their role in the Middle East. But she has also worked on contemporary politics in the Middle East itself, and IR theories and methodologies are, the tools that she uses. Among her recent publications, she has co-edited Decolonizing Knowledge on Euro-Mediterranean Relations, Insights on Shared History and Futures in 2022. And she has co-edited a huge handbook, Routledge handbook on EU-Middle East relations, published in 2021. And then Professor Emidio Diodato, he is the co-chair of the Standing Group of International Relations, together with me, that is the organizer of this event. He is Professor of Political Science, where he teaches international relations, in fact, at the University for Foreigners in Perugia. and he has dealt particularly with geopolitics and Italian foreign policy, let alone working on international relations at large. Among his recent publications this year, 2023, with Il Mulino, he has co-authored the book, a book on Italian foreign policy, Manuale di Politica Estera Italiana. And with his colleague Niglia in 2018, The Diplomat, Populism and Foreign Policy in Italy with Springer. So as you can understand, the panel is mainly composed by area experts, but all of them are also international relations scholars. So they are particularly fit for something, a roundtable organized by the Standing Group of International Relations on a very topical issue. Now, the floor to them, and I would start...
Yeah, maybe you should add also Andrea Ruggeri.
Oh my God, I'm very sorry. Andrea, apologies. Andrea Ruggeri is a professor of international relations at Oxford University. As you can see, his location is the most fascinating one. Andrea Ruggeri is not only a well-known scholar in the UK, being in Oxford, but he's also well-known at the Standing Group of International Relations, where he has organized many issues, many gatherings, and recently a roundtable at our conference. He's an expert on several things, among which civilian violence on civilians in conflict. And he has published widely on his topics of interest. And his contribution here will be precisely on the topic on which he is well known for, which is violence of civilians in conflicts. Sorry, I apologize for having omitted Andrea in the first round. Raffaella. Now, the question to you is derived from your book on Israel under siege. In the book, you explain that since 2000, as a response to a series of circumstances, namely the failure of the Oslo peace process, the trauma of the Second Intifada, and Ahmadinejad presidency in Iran, we have assisted to a shift to the right and a sort of emergence of a sense of feeling of being under siege in Israel. Now, in this context, the neo-revisionist right represented by the current president, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his party promoted a hardline policy towards the region. And this was aimed also to reduce domestic dissent and also produce, in a sense, international isolation. Do you believe that this sort of securitization of Israel's foreign domestic policy has played a role in Hamas' decision to attack Israel? And has it played a role also in the inability of Israel to forecast the attack?
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Emidio, for inviting me to the panel. Good morning and buongiorno to everyone. So let me start by saying that since I published the book, that was in 2017, the right-wing shift in Israeli politics and society has continued relentlessly. And the culmination of this trend is the current Netanyahu government, which is in place since last December. Now, this government coalition not only includes Jewish ultra-Orthodox parties, but also three parties of the extreme right that, taken together, are the the third largest faction in the Israeli Knesset. We're talking here about parties that are led by fanatics. I have to be very clear about that, such as Itamar Ben-Gvir, who in the past was a member of a party that was outlawed in Israel and designated a Jewish terrorist organization. He was also barred from military service for being too radical. He was at the forefront in the incitement campaign of the Israeli right against Yitzhak Rabin, who was accused of being a traitor for signing the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. And Ben-Gvir has been indicted dozens of times for incitement to racism, support of the Kach terrorist group, and he was convicted on these charges in 2007. Now he serves in the current Israeli government as Minister of National Security. Bezalel Smotrich, another leader of the far right-wing alliance, is equally known for racist and illiberal positions. For example, he had stated that the Palestinian town of Wara that was rampaged by Israeli settlers should be wiped out. He also defines himself as a proud homophobe. As Ben-Gvir, Smotrich said, both politicians and their supporters are against the establishment of a Palestinian state, as are by now more Likud. These guys are also in favor of expanding Israel's control over the West Bank, and they dream of annexation. Now, Smotrich now is the Minister of Finance. He's also a minister in the Defense Ministry and has been in charge of the civil administration of the West Bank. Now, and as for Netanyahu, well, he had orchestrated the murder of these three small far-right parties so that they could pass the electoral threshold before the elections. He has legitimized them. He's also dependent on these extremists to stay in power. Just to remind you that Netanyahu is indicted on 3 counts of corruption. So how has this shift, this additional shift to the right, manifested itself more recently? Well, a massive expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, even more than under previous right governments. A growing number of settler attacks on Palestinians and their property that go unpunished. This is very much in line with the fight electoral slogan, who is the landlord here? Mi Baal Bayit. An even higher number of Palestinian prison administrative detention, repeated attempts to change the status quo at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque, incitement against anyone they consider the enemies of Israel, including Israel's Arab citizens, left-wing intellectuals, and progressive NGOs. And also the filling of senior administrative positions with incompetent political cronies. And perhaps most importantly, an attempt to reform Israel's judicial system, for which the better term is perhaps judicial coup. What is this reform about? It is about curbing the power of the Israeli Supreme Court, who will no longer be able to assess the constitutionality of laws. It's about giving the power to override any rulings of the Supreme Court, and also granting the government control over judicial appointments. And these are just the first steps of a much broader reform plan. Now, why are reforms important for Israel's right-wing government? Well, first of all, because some of them don't value democracy, or at least not democracy by which they could lose power, let's put it like that. Many also believe that Jewish law, or the restrictive interpretation of it, is superior to state law. Second, because in the past, Supreme Court rule occasionally limited the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, particularly on private Palestinian land. And the Supreme Court has occasionally also intervened in protecting Palestinian rights. Now, with that gone, of course, Israel could do whatever it wants in the West Bank, even more so than today. And finally, because the politicized and powerless judiciary could keep Netanyahu out of jail, right? Now, this planned judicial coup has met the resistance of a considerable segment of Israeli society. There were mass demonstrations that went on for 40 consecutive weeks from January to October. The mass mobilization also included army reservists that announced that they would not show up for reserve duty. Although we have to be clear that only a very small faction of the protesters stressed the linkage between the assault on Israeli democracy and Israel's occupation. Now, how is all of this related to attacks of Hamas on the 7th of October? And let me just take a moment to remind us that the attacks killed more than 1,200 Israelis in a single day, many of them civilians, slaughtered in their homes or while attending a rave party. There are also reports of sexual assault and rape, which there is much silence. And of course, as you know, Hamas also took around 40 hostages, of which about 100 have been released by now. And all of this, and I would also like to stress that, does not, in my view, justify Israel's assault on the Gaza Strip and the killing of Palestinian civilians there. So how is all of that I've just been saying related to the Hamas attacks? And I would like to stress 3 points here. First, Israeli governments have continued the policy of keeping Hamas contained, but functional in the Gaza Strip, while undermining the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Smotrich and Netanyahu, they are on record saying that the real danger to the establishment of a Palestinian state, which they oppose, is not Hamas, but the Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority. And accordingly, Israel has allowed suitcases of being brought in by Qatar to finance Hamas. There have been repeated military assaults, which was called mowing the lawn. There have been repeated attempts to undermine any reconciliation attempt between Fatah and Hamas. It's difficult to begin with. Not that I'm saying that, you know, it's all the fault of Israel, but Israel certainly had an interest in keeping the two separated. And there are also reports that whole battalions stationed in the south of Israel were redeployed to the West Bank to protect the settlers. Second, the defense minister and the security establishment had warned Netanyahu that the planned judicial coup and government's intent to go on in spite of the demonstrations. So there were warnings that the judicial coup was weakening Israeli society and the army. Minister of Defense Gallant had publicly called on Netanyahu to halt the legislation, that was in March, warning that it was tearing apart the military and threatening its combat readiness. Netanyahu ignored this. He even fired Gallant before he was forced to reinstate him. So this is the second aspect. The third, the so-called Abraham Accords that Israel signed with the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan in 2020, and the impending normalization deal with Saudi Arabia did not entail any provision to end Israel's occupation, let alone to soothe the blockade of the Gaza Strip. And so on the one hand, the so-called Abraham Accords certainly countered Israel's sense of regional nation that right-wing governments had so skillfully employed to advance their right-wing policies. But here, and according to the worldview of Israeli governments, drew another conclusion, namely that Israel could now further expand Israel's violent control of the Palestinians with impunity and continue to demonize Israel's Arab citizens and any domestic opponents to the rule. So these 3 factors may well have influenced Hamas' decision to attack Israel on the 7th of October. I'm not providing a justification. I'm just saying these are possible explanations, although, of course, I really don't know what goes on in the head of Hamas leaders. And these factors also partly explain Israel's inability to foresee the attacks, or better, to take existing warnings seriously, although there are certainly additional factors here which perhaps we can discuss later, because I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raffaella. This leads us directly into the core of the issue and the interesting relationship between domestic aspects and international and regional aspects. And in this respect, I think it follows consequentially to think of the broader area and the role of the other actors in the area. And in particular, I would ask Andrea Teti a reflection on this. So that we all fear that the current conflict will enlarge to the broader region. Regional powers like Turkey, Iran, Saudi, or Egypt seems to be sort of sitting on a side, not doing much. I mean, statements of solidarity, but at the same time, we risk that the conflict can broaden to the wider area. So can you illuminate us more on the role of the other regional actors and what might this imply for the future of the conflict?
Sure, thanks. First of all, thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everyone, particularly Raffaella, who's just given a brilliant summary of the situation on the Israeli side. I think what I have to say will slot into that, and hopefully it's quite complementary. So I think in order to understand, I mean, the interesting thing is that, like you were saying, Sonia, that the other Arab governments seem to be making the right noises, so to speak, sort of voicing opposition, voicing concern, sometimes in quite stark ways. For example, Jordan, sometimes making kind of palliative moves to be seen to oppose what's going on in Gaza and in the West Bank, and so on. And yet there's very little action. So how can we explain that? Why is that? And what does that mean in terms of risks of spillover and sort of for the future sort of developments of the situation? I think we need to understand two sets of factors to start with. First of all, or rather two sets of roots, as it were, of the conflict in general. One is kind of long-term roots and the other predictably short-term roots. And then what I want to say is a little bit about the structural weaknesses of Arab regimes and how these two things in combination help us decode, understand both why Arab governments have been behaving the way that they have been, and also what the possibilities, the likelihoods of them taking one stance or another in strategically speaking. So I'm not talking about specific measures, but strategically speaking, what they're likely or less likely to do in the near to medium future. So first of all, the question of the roots, and the long-term roots in particular. Those long-term roots, those long-term structural historical factors come from the fact that Israel in its genesis is very much seen and is the result and in the context of European imperialism, British and French imperialism. For those of you who don't know, of course, the UK and France were the primary forces behind the carving up of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. And one of the classic strategies that those powers used at the time in order to set up the post-Ottoman order was so-called divide and rule tactics. And you can see this deployed in different ways, in different contexts. For example, Lebanon, as opposed to Jordan, as opposed to Syria, Iraq, and so on. All of them display some kind of structural weakness that afforded European powers an influence in, or at least in the designs of those powers themselves, afforded some kind of influence on the post-Ottoman order. And Israel-Palestine is in a way no different. It's maybe, perhaps not very common to see it in this way, but effectively what the British set up in the Transjordanian Mandate and then in the kind of the Palestinian Mandate that's separated out from Jordan is a divide and rule situation. In a way, it's a divide and rule situation gone wrong, because as opposed to, for example, Lebanon, I mean, of course, Lebanon went wrong in a bunch of different ways, but in the sense that it didn't afford the British influence in Palestine as they, mandatory Palestine, as they had hoped. And in fact, what it did was create these kind of structural causes for division. The fact that you have these two nationalistic self-determination, classic end 19th, early 20th century nationalist projects on the same parcel of land, and the impossibility or the difficulty of seeing a one-state solution, whether that's mandatory Palestine or whether it's a kind of post-Oslo one-state solution. So beyond the contingent factors of what may have led to Hamas to carry out the attack on the October 7th, or the contingent factors that lead to Israel's seemingly entirely disproportionate response, which perhaps we can discuss later, beyond the issues of whether the Abraham Accords are part of a successful normalization of relations between Israel and Arab governments or not. These are the kinds of contexts, or this is an important component of the context that we have to keep in mind, analyzing the contemporary situation, but also the possibilities of its resolution in the near to medium future, at least. In the short term, I want to say a little bit to connect to what Raffaella was saying about the Abraham Accords and kind of Arab-Israeli normalization at a governmental level. Of course, the immediate answer to what I just said is, well, we need to find a kind of a lasting peace for the lasting resolution of the Palestinian question, and that means some form of peace arrangement. The dominant way of thinking about this at a governmental level is still the two-state solution. I'm not particularly skeptical, sort of confident that that is realistic anymore, but in any case, the point that I want to make is that there are two ways in which you can seek peace, two broad types of peace that one can use. One is a sort of what I might call palliative peace, which is being pursued until now, which it basically, the approach is to try and get governments to come together in the hope that they can then isolate themselves from the pressures from their respective populations sufficiently to effectively parcel out the Palestinian question from their respective domestic politics and regional politics as a whole. This is not a new project at all. If you think about, the reason why the Palestine Liberation Organization was created under Nasser, it was precisely for that reason. If you think about the whole point of the Camp David Accords, remember there are two accords, right? One is Israeli peace, Egyptian peace, and the other is the question of Palestine. And if you look at the Abraham Accords, again, you have the kind of issues that came up in the Camp David Accords that undermined them. In other words, not recognizing Palestinian rights, self-determination, etc. So this palliative peace approach, kind of governmental level convergence, has been tried before. It's basically the dominant frame through which a resolution has been sought at least since 1973, and it doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work to the extent that, and we'll see why this is important, it actually destabilizes, decreases the stability, especially inside Arab states, creates a context within which those states are vulnerable to mass mobilization, for example, through the question of Palestine, and fundamentally does not address the structural causes of the Palestinian-Israeli problem, question, conflict, whatever you want to call it, in the first place. So there's a palliative piece on the one hand, and there's a positive piece on the other, which is an approach which does the exact opposite of what I just said. In other words, to seek a resolution, to focus on structural causes, to focus on structural drivers of mobilization inside Israel, Palestine, and the Arab Middle East context, which are three different contexts which we can talk about later on. But the roots of that project, that positive peace project, is what you could call peace with justice, which is accused of being kind of peacenik, lefty slogan, but it is not. It is, it may be, but that's not relevant. What's relevant is the fact that it actually addresses the structural causes of the conflict, of the tensions. Now, why is it difficult to address those structural causes? Raffaella has mentioned on the Israeli side this kind of shift to the right. I would add that, of course, the fact that there is no check on an incentive, there's no incentive provided by the United States, first and foremost, to reach a kind of a negotiated, just peace, a positive peace along the lines that I mentioned a moment ago, and no pressure on Israel to do so has been one of the permissive causes of this kind of rightwards drift. Not the only one, but it is one of them. Rightwards drift in Israeli politics, which would be worrying in and of itself, regardless of the context. I want to conclude by saying a couple of things about the Arab context, and that becomes the key through which to understand, for example, Qatar's stance, the UAE, Saudis, the Egyptians, and the Jordanians, right? So to talk about MENA autocracies in general is quite problematic. It's a very diverse bunch internally, but they do have a couple of things in common that are relevant in this context. First of all, they're structurally precarious autocracies. They have a combination of a high repressive capacity, mostly, see Arab uprisings, versus a low legitimacy, right? So if you ask, for example, if you use survey data to ask, what do citizens think about what states do, the bread and butter of what states do, the preference, the trust levels, confidence levels are extremely low, between 10, 20, 30%, and so on. The highest scoring, for example, are places like Jordan on kind of public welfare services and so on. But generally speaking, those data speak to an internal deficit of legitimacy that is a very well-known fact for scholars of the region. So you have this combination, on the one hand, structural weakness, a lack of legitimacy, and on the other hand, of course, a search for legitimacy, kind of stabilizing internally. And this, again, regardless of the specific instance of the Palestinian or the Gaza question since October 7th and so on. One of the ways in which the classic way in which those Arab regimes face these conditions is through kind of anti-Western rhetoric domestically, to kind of play the anti-colonial, theatrical anti-colonial card, and accuse Western powers, Europeans, etc., of all the ills that that they are at least partly responsible for, right? And Palestine is precisely located in that context. So that's the kind of strategy that this is why we've been seeing Arab regimes making statements of concern, etc., etc. The lightness, the soft touch with which those statements have mostly been made, possibly with the exception of Abdullah II, who's made more significant statements, but of course more than half of his population is Palestinian. So this kind of soft touch derives from the fact that those regimes need to isolate themselves from their own population. So they have a problem of structural inequality and instability internally. If they mobilize their population, and their entire strategy of rule is based on the demobilization of mass political participation. So if they use that rhetoric too strongly, too much, they mobilize the population too much, they run the risk of that mobilization turning against them, right? The perfect example of this is the Arab uprisings. If you think about where the genealogy of those social movements, opposition movements, is mostly, not only, but mostly located, it's precisely in the protests that were authorized by the regimes, for example, the Egyptian regime, in the wake of, or between the Second Intifada and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And from those mobilizations that didn't, sometimes they addressed the regimes themselves, but were broadly understood as coded critiques of their respective regimes. And from those mobilizations, you have these kind of laboratories of collaboration between leftists, liberals, moderate Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, in Egypt, and so on, that you see characterize the following decade and that are central to the Arab uprising, so to the Egyptian revolution of 2011, the 25th of January. So there's this kind of balancing act that these regimes need to undertake, and it's a very precarious one, right? That's why you have these kind of very moderate statements. Then as far as, I want to say, I mean, of course, Iran is not an Arab country, but some of the same principles apply to that context as well. And Iran and Qatar have been important in terms of their kind of the regional position in different ways. Iran made extremely clear, as Hezbollah did very early on, that they wanted no part of a regional escalation, a broadening of the conflict for various reasons. And on the other hand, Egypt and Jordan have been notably increasingly sidelined. Egyptians are quite apparently annoyed about all of this. but there's not a lot that they can do. One of the reasons, again, is structural, because Egypt is in this position not just locked in by the Egyptian-Israeli Treaty of 79 and relations with the US and so on, but also because, again, their domestic population is, or their control of the domestic population is based on kind of their marginalization, and they're unwilling to address the structural causes of their own instability, the sort of polarization in income, the repression of political participation, et cetera, which would allow them to do, for example, what Nasser did, which is to ride waves of public support, use that as leverage both domestically, regionally, and on Israel, and on the US primarily, in order to reach a kind of negotiated settlement. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I think these are the kinds of factors that we need to keep in mind. On the one hand, the long-term structural roots of the project or the genesis of the Israeli state, both in its imperial kind of colonial context and in its, let's say, two-state solution matrix or genesis to start with, and then outside of that, in the Arab context, the structural weaknesses that lead Arab regimes, on the one hand, to need to make these statements protesting what the Israelis have been doing, and on the other hand, the impossibility of them taking it too far, lest they mobilize their domestic populations and make their own position even more precarious than it already is.
So thank you very much, Andrea. This clarifies even more a very, very complex and worrisome picture, because the elements we see are of a different level, domestic, regional, and international. And here we come to the international level with Daniela Huber, who I would kindly ask us to illuminate us on the international relations, on the international relations dimension of what is happening. So in particular, on the role of the European Union and the US. We heard before that the failure of the US to put pressure or sufficient pressure on Israel. We also read a lot about the weak reaction on the side of the Europeans. It seems that all the cohesion that we acknowledged in the case of the reaction towards the war in Ukraine has disappeared here in Gaza. So if you could tell us more about this Western reaction to the war, and what are the implications, particularly for the European Union where we live. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much to you, Sonia, and to Emidio for organizing this. And let me just open my slides that I had. Can you see them? Okay. I also want to say that I absolutely agree with the excellent analysis of Raffaella and Andrea. And actually, a lot of my presentations speaks to what Andrea has already introduced. Particularly, also, I wanted to bring in the more longue durée perspective on this and analyze the very much intertwined European and US response also through a historical lens. In particular, as you can see on the first slide, I would like to follow how they have actually shaped and evolved within particular dominant international normative framings of the conflict over time. And walking on that timeline, I want to make 6 particular points which I think are very pertinent to our debate today. So first, we have, of course, the British Mandate period, which Andrea already mentioned, which incorporates the Balfour Declaration that, as we all know, promised to support a national home for the Jewish people while ignoring the right to self-determination of the local Arab-Palestinian majority. Now, this support to a Jewish national home happens, of course, in a context of rampant, violent, and then genocidal anti-Semitism in Russia and Europe. And here is a first point, which I find largely missing in the debate in the European public space today, which is that Europe has been at the very beginning of this conflict, and there is something of what Gurminder Bambre has called a disjunct in our memory today, in the sense that in Europe, we remember this as a past, while Israelis and Palestinians alike, I would like to stress, are living with the very concrete ongoing legacies of that very past. So we move to the post-mandate period in which the Israeli right to self-determination is realized in statehood, while the Palestinian right to self-determination remains unfulfilled despite Resolution 181, the partition plan. In terms of the international normative framing of the conflict, the Palestine question is no longer treated in terms of a state, but as a refugee question. The conflict is now managed by the two superpowers through the UN and through international law, which is evident in 1956, when the two of them actually collaborate to force the UK, France, and Israel to retreat from the Sinai. Happens, of course, in line with the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force. For Europe, this means the end of French and British colonial power, and indeed a few months later, the Rome Treaty is signed. Now, a next period sets in 1967 with Resolution 242, Land for Peace. And Andrea, in some way, already alluded to what I will say here, because there is a second key point I would like to make. We have a clear rupture emerging on the international now, because the US now takes over mediation and sidelines the UN. And secondly, the US comes forward with a new paradigm, which prioritizes peace over justice. Andrea mentioned this already. So in other words, the idea is no longer, as in 1956, an unconditional withdrawal from the occupied territories, but withdrawal is now conditioned on peacemaking. Now, how do the Europeans move in this new US-led paradigm? There are actually two periods. In the 1970s and 80s, the Europeans very much contested this US position. Indeed, what is interesting is that in that period, we actually do see European strategic autonomy, which is a third point I would like to make here. The European community actually forms its whole new foreign policy cooperation on that particular conflict. It insists on Israel's right of existence, but it also insists on a Palestinian right of self-determination, on international law and the end of occupation in the 70s and 80s. That was still a very outspoken point, on the flagrant violation of international law, which the settlements constitute, and it also insists still on the role of the UN. And with this unified position, what is interesting, it actually has a direct normative impact on the US position as well. Now, in the 1990s, this changes because the EU now moves under the US-led Middle East peace process, which of course assures a degree of coherence amongst the position of now a larger number of EU member states. The EU does maintain some autonomy in the peace process in the sense that it pushes for Palestinian statehood, but always conditioned on negotiations, not as an unconditional right, but conditioned on negotiations. It insists on the unity of the West Bank and Gaza and on the flagrant violation of international law of the settlements. Now, what happens in this overall peace process period is that the actually guiding idea of land for peace fades. And that's my fourth point here. On one hand, we see that Israel disengages from Gaza, as it also does from southern Lebanon, unilaterally. That means it does not actually happen in the context of a negotiated disengagement, which creates something of a vacuum. And then secondly, the territory of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is now extremely fractured by the separation barrier and wall and by the settlements, with the settlement population now standing at more than 700,000. And this makes visible, I think, another point which Andrea already mentioned, how the lack of accountability to international law in the peace process is a real liability for the possibility of peace itself. Now, it is in this particular situation that we move into a new time period because the Palestinian leadership takes the decision to take their struggle for their rights back to the United Nations and into the rules-based international order. And what happens now is that this is the very moment when the European Union's consensus actually begins to fracture and the European Union begins to lose its actorness, which is my fifth point. Now, the dominant explanation for this lack of cohesion, which you already mentioned, Sonia, in the EU is often the rise of populism. But I would like to argue here and show you also why I argue this is that this fracture actually evolves around the position of Germany, which is much more gravitational than an actor of Hungary, of course, in the sense that its position lends a certain degree of legitimacy for other states actually adopt the same positions as Germany does. So what happens is that the Palestinian liberation organizations move the statehood bit into the United Nations. And here you can see the voting record of the European Union, both on the full membership status and on the non-member state bit. And when the non-member state bit passes, the EU actually starts to try to dissuade the PLO to take the question to the International Criminal Court. But Palestine signs the Rome Statute and confers the case to the ICC, which rules that it has jurisdiction on the case against expressed German dissent directly to the court. And we need to know that Germany is the main funder of the court. So the whole investigation actually remains stalled. In January 2023, the General Assembly has requested an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legality of the prolonged occupation in light of the Palestinian right to self-determination. And here you can see the voting record on that vote. So what becomes very evident here is that it is Germany which leads this bloc in the European Union, which is opposed to applying the provisions and protections of international law to the Palestinians. And so we see this division that was so clear also in the situation. Now we see that already in the making for a decade. Now, the US in that same time period that I was just referring to, eventually also abandoned the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and increasingly goes for Arab-Israeli normalization. The Europeans are not opposed to this, but they are also not particularly enthusiastic about it because it doesn't solve the Palestine question. And in that, it's very similar to the European position on the Camp David Accords. And this period overall sets the stage, I would say, for both the US and EU reaction after October 7. And here I would like to make a last 6 point, and I go then back to this slide maybe, arguing that we might be witnessing a rupture similar to 1967 again. So on the global level, the EU-US response accelerates the crisis of the rules-based order and also of the liberal order. I would say the humanitarian performativity show of the EU and the US can hardly make up for the lack of unequivocal support for international law. And here's actually the voting record on the ceasefire resolution. The US and the EU have provided 125 million in humanitarian aid respectively. But the US has, to the Palestinians, to Gaza, but the US has provided 14 billion in military aid to Israel, and Germany's arms export have risen to more than 300 million euros this year. So there is a very clear asymmetry here. Also, the liberal order has received a major hit, including within our own societies, as we see that anti-Semitic, anti-Palestinianist and Islamophobic attacks have really skyrocketed. And we also witness restrictions on the liberty of expression and assembly in our societies. In the US, it seems right now that this might actually also have an impact on the next elections, particularly for what regards younger voters. On the regional level, the EU and the US has lost a large degree of recognition, including by major allies such as Jordan. And this will most likely, I think, also accelerate the tendency of Arab states to entertain China as an alternative. Now, Saudi Arabia, I think, won't be able to formalize normalization with Israel. So that US approach is also deeply challenged. And to conclude and to go to the local level, for what regards the short term, Borrell and Blinken have come out with 3 no's. So no forced displacement, no amputation of Gaza, and no reoccupation and no disassociation of Gaza from Palestine. But it is very unclear how they want to ensure these 3 no's. They do, again, not mention any accountability mechanisms. So I think we should watch very closely how the EU and the US want to assure that in the very moment that and all the things that are happening on the ground in Gaza right now. But for what concerns the longer term, they both suggested to bring the corrupt Palestinian Authority to Gaza and to revive the 2-state solution. And here, I think the solution instead, there needs to be a paradigm shift. The solution needs to come from the local level. And for this, there needs to be a new leadership on both sides. And so it would be actually very important that the US and EU support free elections also for the Palestinians, so that people can actually begin to determine their own fate. And I will stop here, and I think we can then go into detail on various points in the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. So I think we had three very, very informative and excellent introductions. I have already a lot of questions, but my plan would be to have all the presentations first and then go again to the speakers with my and most of all your questions. So now we have seen the domestic level, the regional level, we have seen the international response, but something that we haven't tackled is what probably has striken the most, I mean, the general public worldwide, and definitely has impacted upon us in Europe, which is the degree of violence that we have seen, the degree of involvement of civilians. Is something that we know happening worse, but this is happening to an extent that probably we were not considering possible anymore, particularly when a democracy is involved. We like to think of the fact that democracies behave in a different way, not, terrorists are terrorists, so what can you expect from them? But from a democracy, we usually expect, compliance with international law and attention to civilians, even in war. Now, what is happening here in this war is striking, first of all, for the in terms of the results of the attacks, Hamas attacks that were targeting civilians directly. And that has been definitely a shocking thing. And it's still going on with the kidnapped people. But at the same time, the response in Gaza is at a level of violence that we might want to explore, from a more academic, scientific point of view. So going beyond the immediate emotional aspect, I would ask Andrea Ruggeri, apologizing once again for failing to introduce you properly. I would kindly ask you to help us understand what is happening here in terms of violence against civilians and whether this is part of a trend. What your research can tell us with respect to what is happening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this event. And I have to preface saying a couple of things. Clearly, I'm going to talk about a very difficult topic, a topic that is extremely normative and political charge. So I will try to be very careful. I'm not an Israel-Palestine expert. I've been in Israel several times. I was last time in the summer 22, and I visited actually the Gaza envelope and West Bank. But my work is mostly to understand the logics of violence and civil war, and the logic of violence also during war. So I will not use terms from a legal perspective or a normative perspective. I will try to be analytical. Yeah, I know that when I will talk about numbers, and I will actually, in the first part, I will talk about numbers. I know that when we use numbers, it seems that we forget that each number is a person, has a family, and there is a tragic story. So, but I think it's essential to start with the numbers, because as Professor Lucarelli was saying, I think we have to gauge the dimension of what is happening now in Gaza. But let me start from the 7th of October. And of course, the 7th of October did not happen in a political vacuum using the UN Secretary General, but also going back to Dr. Huber and Professor Teti points. But let's start on the 7th of October and what happened in terms of attack and violence towards civilians by Hamas. We had more than 1,200 people that were killed. and more than 800 civilians, and around 5,000 people wounded. As Professor Sarto has mentioned, we started to have some initial reports about systematic use of sexual violence against young women and women in all stages of life. So there was a systematic goal to humiliate and target civilians. This attack caused also 150,000 IDPs within the Israeli territory, so people that they moved from the Gaza envelope. And in those couple of days, there were 4,500 missiles, rockets from Hamas toward the Israeli territory. Notice that if we compare this with the Gaza war 2014, the same number of rockets in 2 days were shot actually in 2 weeks in 2014. Also, comparing the Gaza war in 2014, we had 67 Israeli killed and 1,700 Palestinians killed. So here we are focusing on an event that the literature suggests is a traumatic event because it's clearly an outlier in the history of Israel. In the Yom Kippur 1973, over 3 weeks, there were 2,600 soldiers killed, soldiers, not civilians, over 3 weeks. So this is clearly a moment where the targeting of civilians is part of a strategy of Hamas and is a traumatic emotional shock for all Israeli citizens. Said that, I think we have to start thinking about the reaction after 7 October. That has been a military action that has, I will discuss about the name of the operation, the Swords of Iron, that actually use heavy, extremely heavy aerial attack. The bomb used in these aerial attacks arrived to 2,000 pounds, so 900 kilos bombs in urban warfare. At the end of November, the latest data we got, we know that we have reached more than 14,000 killed among the Palestinian and the Gaza area. And of these, 10,000 are women and children. Among these, actually on top of these, there are also 100 UN personnel who were actually providing humanitarian support. One of the most shocking analytically aspect of this number is also the pace. Any scholar working on victimization of civilians would notice that the number of people killed in such a short pace is quite an outlier. Nita Crawford, director of Cost of War, has clearly said that we are completely disoriented in this situation. Because after 2 weeks, we had 4,000 killed, and after other 2 weeks, 8,000. There has been a upwards increase. The Israeli Defense Force report of being killing 5,000 Hamas people. The Gaza data, if you match, it would say 4,000. But what is clearly shocking is the quantity against the civilians. And thanks to satellite images, we also know that 60% of the buildings in the north of Gaza have been destroyed, 60%. 1.8 million are IDPs, internally displaced. That means overall the population, 80% of the population has been internally displaced. So again, the aspect that is shocking and also brings our attention, and I think the public attention, but also the scholar on these very few weeks, is the magnitude and the pace of the violence. The Swords of Iron operation, if we look at what they try to do, what they state to do, is to eradicate Hamas. Gaza City has been 4,000 IDF forces arrive. Also, there are more than 350,000 reserves are being called. A major mobilization that is also the first declaration of war since 1973 for the state of Israel. Clearly, what we notice, and I'm going to mention Yagil Levi, a very important military sociologist in Israel, but also Stefan Biddle, what we notice is that we cannot claim that the level of victimization of civilians is just a byproduct of a military tactic. What we are saying is that given the magnitude, there means that there has been an acceptation, a level of tolerance among the planning of the attack about actually tolerating a large amount of civilian deaths. The tactic, therefore, is a tactic to basically a direct one to eliminate physically Hamas, but also without paying attention for a large respect to the civilians. There is also an indirect tactic that has been stated also by Israeli politicians that is basically creating a level of desperation among the population, and the population will target Hamas leadership directly. So there are two tactics that are being used. Of course, as Larry Friedman said in the Financial Times recently, the problem is that it seems there is not a political strategy. Going to the scientific literature, and it's extremely hard to compare it because, you know, this is a quite unique case because it's not the civil war. We are looking at a military operation in occupied territories in order to repress a terrorist organization. There is an article by Laia Balcells and Jessica Stanton in the Annual Review of Political Science that I think is one of the most important to summarize the logic of violence against civilians during armed conflict. And, you know, one of the characteristics here that we have noticed is that there is very little restraint, as they say. There is high intentionality also to have victimization of civilians. And violence against civilians is not just a practice, but apparently seems a policy. So Kalivas had different logic of violence in his book 2016, but I think something that we can focus is also work I did with Francesco Moro Costali on war politics. It seems to me that a couple of tactical logics are there. One is the logic of tactics that is not about a strategy, it's just to enter with the field troops, but with heavy support of aerial bombing. There is a clear logic of retaliation. Professor Teti already said that retaliation seems clearly disproportionate. And somehow, if in the literature we look at what logic are about targeting civilians, usually is a desperation. The problem is that desperation logic usually is a logic by losers. So two further pieces of literature are useful is the effectiveness of aerial bombing and the long effect of civilian victimization. The literature on aerial bombing, and especially on peace in AJPS 2011, a very important one by Kocher, Pepinski, and Kalivas, looking at the Vietnam and counterinsurgency, really tell us that aerial bombing in terms of counterinsurgency does not work. If anything, supports and moves civilians to support those that are fighting. So they cite Hannah Arendt and they say violence can destroy power. It's utterly incapable of replacing it. So also Conander and Shapiro looking at Iraq, they found similar results. And if I move to the long-term effects of violence and also the effect of war, I think there are very important and good colleagues like Gemansky and Weiss that looking at the Yom Kippur War, they suggest that despite the victory of the Israeli government, but the war and casualty brought a reduction to the incumbent. So war brings a reduction to the support of incumbent, that is Netanyahu. But if we bring another piece of work, is Gemansky and Zaitsov, we know that exposure to rocket attacks from Gaza brings a movement, electoral movement to the right wing. So here there is clearly a possible tension that you know that Netanyahu is about to finish his political career. There is also a logic we can explore of trying to have a total war to possibly survive politically, but also we know that there will be an effect on the voting behavior. Daphne Canetti, looking at the Palestinian, has shown in several work that the exposure to violence has only created humiliation, resentment, and exacerbation, that has created higher militance in radicalism and extremism. I'm going to stop here. I tried to bring some data, but also some findings, and I do believe the picture is indeed tragic, and even I think more tragic if we will see further action toward the south area of Gaza.
Thank you very much, Andrea. The picture turns ever more gloomy the more we go on. And before starting the discussion, general discussion, I would like to pass the word to Professor Emidio Diodato for some closing remarks and probably also some questions to the speakers. So it's a sort of discussion.
Thank you, Sonia. We had not enough time, I think. Thank you for conducting this roundtable. Since it's a roundtable, maybe we can have a second round without my interventions, okay?
Okay, so if you have, I mean, whatever comment or question to the speakers, of course, you can use this time to.
Okay, very, very briefly, lesson learned. I have nothing to add, just lesson learned. Professor De Sarto, what about democracy? We discussed about democracy as a key element in international relations, looking at Ukraine or maybe in Taiwan. So can we, democracy is not on the table in understanding this conflict. And Professor Teti talked about the risk of spillover. There are some elements, in your opinion, to consider this conflict as similar to what happened at the beginning of the First World War. As you know, there is a huge debate about the topic. Professor Huber, do you think that the cleavage of the global South cleavage is very well discussed in this period, you know, and can tells us something about this conflict, also inside the Western world, not only look at the Middle East. And Professor Ruggeri, yes, you talked about the overreacting of Israel, and as a policy, not as a practice. This was very interesting to me, and how the numbers are outlier. So can you explain this unique case? Why it's so unique? Thank you.
So before giving back the floor to you, I would ask the participants if they have questions, they can either turn on the microphone, raise your hand, turn on the microphone and pose a question, or put it in the chat. And while I wait for others to add questions, I have this big one, which is the one that probably everybody can wonder about. So two-state solution seems to be very hard to achieve. At the same time, the war is creating even worse conditions for a lasting peace. It has definitely radicalized positions on both sides. So what the hell can we do? Well, sorry, it was not very academic and professional, but it's very hard to think of one solution, one possible solution. And what the international actors can do, it seems to me from what has been said that the role of the international actors is not that huge. either because there is not enough coherence or because there is not enough pressure, but also because there is a sort of reluctance on the regional actors to take lesson from anyone or to simply give up to external pressures. So the regional dynamics are too strong and the domestic concerns are too much there. Even personal concerns, I think, of what has been said previously about the Israeli leadership. So what is in your mind, whether the two-state solution is still feasible or not, and if not, what else? Let me see if there are questions. Professor De Salto, a question to you from Gaetano Giancaspro. Could you please tell us more about the opposition parties in Israel at the moment, how they are dealing with the war in this moment? It seems that the war has also killed the opposition to a certain extent, I would add. So if there are no other questions.
There's a question from
yes, Angela. Sorry, Angela
Hi.
Romano.
Good morning, Angela Romano. I'm an international historian and I'm at the University of Bologna. So I have a few questions. I'll ask the panel and then you decide who wants to address them. So they do connect with questions that have been already posed. So one is indeed on democracy in Israel and opposition. And I continue to hear and read that Netanyahu is very interested in continuing the war because that's the only way he has to stay in power. And I was wondering, democracies have always voted during wars, at least in Europe. So why is this a narrative about we can't have elections, we can't go and replace a government because there's a war going on? And do you see any possibilities that the Israeli citizens who have protested indeed for 20 weeks for other reasons would actually claim elections out of outrage and discontent with this government, which was already ongoing and might be emphasized, actually deepened by the conduct of the war? The second question is, well, I'll sound very cynic, but what is in there for the European Union in blindly supporting any Israeli government's approach to the question? Because I will sound a little bit like Marshammer and what, but I really do not understand, never understood how, by trying to project democratic values, upholding international law, human rights. Is it possible for the European Union, in particular, the USA for me has always been another beast, to actually give up upholding these very fundamental values and still pretend to be an international actor or have any seat? And this is particularly dramatic since the invasion of Ukraine, by the complete invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we are losing ground with the global south, because it is true that we are applying double standards. It is appalling that even Zelensky, I'm very sorry to say that, compared Ukraine with Israel, is that's not the thing. There is an occupying power and it's not the Palestinians. And this, by the way, is only strengthening Hamas, which is a horrific organization, which we certainly do not want to dominate or even be a relevant actor. But we, again, allowed that to be the case, and we supported implicitly Netanyahu's strategy, because this is not something that is very convenient for Netanyahu to have. It was explicitly mentioned, I don't remember the year, at a party congress as the strategy his government was going to pursue, and they did, strengthening Hamas. So the question, I guess, is twofold. Why? So what is in there is just blind, or it's just out of the Shoah guilt, which is kind of in the past. I don't understand why we still have to justify the generations in now. They have nothing to do with that. Or is there a calculation that I am absolutely unable to see? And the second part of the question is, Was nobody paying attention to Netanyahu's strategy in the past? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. That was also an excellent set of questions, and I look forward to the replies. Shall we follow the same order as before, if it's fine with you? And you pick up the questions that you want. Raffaella.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for some very, very good and tricky questions. The first one regarding democracy by Emidio. Well, democracy was on the table in Israel, particularly during this 40 weeks of protest, right? Because it was the majority of the protesters, they clearly saw the judicial reform as a judicial coup, and they saw it as an assault on Israeli democracy. As I said before, the majority saw it as an assault on Israeli democracy. A part of the protest movement, they said that there is obviously a connection between democracy in Israel in the 67 borders and the occupation of the West Bank and vis-a-vis the Gaza Strip as well. And although that is that was less emphasized in the Israeli policies in the West Bank. So it is, I mean, it was about democracy. There was a very important protest movement. It wasn't about democracy until the attacks of the 7th of October. Those demonstrations have ended for now. But of course, there is a very high level of mobilization in Israeli civil society. What we have also seen is that there have been these demonstrations in favor of the release of hostages, which at the beginning did not seem to be the first priority of the Israeli of the strategy of the Israeli government, right? Because I mean, if you start if you bomb and if you start a ground invasion, that may very well conflict with the priority to free the hostages. So democracy is certainly on the table. I mean, the other issue of democracy for the Palestinians, that's even complicated, because as you all know, the last elections took place in 2006, and Hamas was voted into power, and the international community and Israel decided to not recognize this electoral result and to impose conditions in order to engage with Hamas, with the party that had won the elections. Now, you know, looking back, with the question of whether Hamas was always set on killing as many civilians as well and just behaved nicely in the last years, or whether it was a missed opportunity because Hamas have changed, right, by bringing it into the political process, I can't answer, right? I mean, there are experts on Hamas, and as far as I know, even the experts on Hamas don't agree with each other, so it's a bit tricky. The question of what the opposition is doing. Opposition in Israel, as I said, on the one hand, you do have demonstrations in favor of bringing first the hostages home. The political opposition, well, one of the opposition leader has joined the war cabinet, in a way also saving the... What we see, and I think that's pretty typical in situations of conflict and wars, and particularly as Andrea Ruggeri was saying, I mean, extreme trauma, right? Extreme trauma in Israeli society. At the moment, there is a around the flag effect, right? And I think we see that in other places as well. Elections, nobody really talks about elections. Interestingly, there is opposition within the rising opposition within the Likud party, Netanyahu's rule. And it was also said that for Netanyahu, the longer the war goes on, the easier it is for to at least he thinks that this could be his political, this could secure his political survival. He also had already tried started a campaign to basically blame the army, blame the security services for the October 7th attack, you know, saying like, I'm not responsible, they are responsible, right? So already started this time. And yes, of course, I mean, there could be elections, but as I said, I mean, I think it very much depends on how the situation in Gaza develops, the strategy, how many hostages will be freed, and so on. And regarding the big question of Sonia, well, that's of course a very, very difficult one. I think what is interesting is that the two-state solution, or any political solution, is again back on the table, not in Netanyahu's mind, apparently, but certainly at the level of the international community. While there has been in the last years or decades even so much talk about the two-state solution, which was really empty talk, right? Trying the need for a political solution is perhaps taken more seriously today by international actors, and I think those that matter are obviously the United States and the European Union. Both have leverage on Israel and the Palestinians. Daniela can perhaps explain better why this leverage, why the Europeans, for example, use this leverage, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrea, Teti?
Thanks for a bunch of really great questions, very important. I'm going to try and be as quick as possible. First of all, what options do we have if the two-state solution is discredited, which it is, or is it not practical, etc.? I don't think the point is options. I think the point is, there are a bunch of options. Is the problem of contiguity between West Bank and Gaza in a putative two-state solution really a problem? Can it be overcome, etc., etc.? How about partial sovereignty? All that kind of stuff. Those are all important questions. But they're completely mute unless you have actors who are willing, whether by their own volition or because they have incentives placed upon them to pursue those options. The problem in the last 25 years, 30 years, has never been the viability of the two-state solution. Personally, I think a one-state solution would be better in terms of resolving those structural causes, but I understand that it's more utopian than a two-state solution at the moment. But the problem is that it's never been pursued realistically. And in fact, the reference that I made to the twin structure of the Camp David Accords is important, because the typical, what I call the palliative peace approach, has always been try to find normalization of bilateral relations via governments, and then something else for Palestine, which has always had the same structure. It's always been, we'll deal with the issues that we can at the moment, and then we'll have this kind of final status negotiations if and when we're ready, and a confidence building period in the meantime. And it's never worked. And what is the famous aphorisms attributed to the Einstein? The repetition of the folly is the definition of repetition of the same actions expecting different outcome under the same conditions, of course, right? So political will, not options, or not so much options. In terms of what the Europe or the US can do, well, I mean, you could start by following their own policies, which is, and I'm making this point facetiously, but it's absolutely crucial, because the policies of the EU, both individually and collectively, and the US, are predicated, at least in principle, on the universality of human rights. From that commitment comes the commitment to international humanitarian law, or jus ad bello, in bello, etc., 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 right? And not to mention the normative power of either of those two, right? The problem is that if you don't practice what you preach, right, there's a vast literature on European normative power, which we know very well. I'm sure the audience knows very well. We know that if it ever was there, it's declining, and you can bet your bottom dollar that the last 8 weeks have pretty much put paid to that credibility, if it did exist in the first place. But if we do not follow the principle that human rights are universal, and that therefore it follows that the international legal instruments and domestic legal instruments designed to uphold them are applied without fear or favor, regardless of who is the victim or who is, the perpetrator, then we have big problems. In terms of the question is there an Israel-Gaza analogy to World War I? I don't think so, because there are no real kind of opposing factions. Even the PRC, the Chinese, have actually extensive industrial and technological cooperation with the Israelis. They have no particular interest in, nothing particularly to gain from, intervening in the context in something along the lines of what the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. On top of which, in particular, they have the constraint of Xinjiang, right? If you act in support of Muslim majority contexts in the Middle East, an immediate question is, what the hell are you doing in Xinjiang, right? So I don't think that analogy holds, thank goodness. Then support for Hamas. I urge everyone to go and look at the Arab Barometer survey that was published finished on the 6th of October. The results were published on the 25th. And both Michael Robbins and Amani Jamal have been talking about these quite extensively on major outlets. There's an article, I think, on Foreign Affairs it was, and so on, that shows that there's a majority, to October 6th, there's a majority that distrusts Hamas to the tune of 2/3 or 3/4, and similarly want a two-state solution. In terms of Hamas's nature, is it an actor that we can deal with? Is it not? And so on. Absolutely right. What Raffaella was saying, that, that this is part of a kind of divide and rule, yet again, divide and rule strategy, in this case by Netanyahu in particular. But I have to say here, there have been repeated, very well documented offers of a truce, a hudna, by Hamas to Israel. The latest one was, I think, last year. There's a nice article a few weeks ago by Yair Wallach on The Guardian that speaks about this, that was refused. Now, some people say, yeah, but it's a truce, it's not a lasting peace, and therefore that shows that Hamas is not committed, and therefore that they're kind of violent and, Islamist, jihadi, ISIS-style organization, which I think is a little bit ridiculous. But I think that's missing the point, because the hudna, willingly or otherwise, a truce is being offered because the credibility that Hamas has, what little of it has left, the purchase that it has inside its Palestinian constituencies, is that it offers what the PNA did not, what the PLO did not, which is resistance to the Israeli occupation. Of course, this is his own rhetoric. It's mostly nonsense and so on. So the reason why they talk in terms of peace and not in terms of, in terms of a truce and not in terms of peace, is because they are the Haraka al-Muqawwama al-Islamiyya, the organization of the Islamic resistance. And that's the key word. Finally, and on the not wanting the destruction of Israel and so on, I think this is really a moot point. There's all sorts of scholarship. There's a lovely book by Bala Garidi, for example, on the genesis, that contains an analysis of the genesis of the infamous Hamas Charter of 1987. But I would invite you to go onto jewishwelterlibrary.com and check out the Likud Charter. The founding charter of 13th September of 1973 contains exactly that sentence: from the river to the sea, there will only be Israeli sovereignty. It rhymes, you look at what I mean in English. So, I think, we don't ask the same questions, or most people don't ask the same questions of Likud than they do of Hamas. I'm not trying to equate the two, but this is just to say one thing is a political theory and rhetoric, another thing is political practice. And I think that there is enough reason to believe that Hamas is, or at least was, a pragmatic enough organization to think that a negotiation for two-state or one-state or whatever was plausible. In terms of, and I'm going to finish on this point, I apologize for taking too long. I agree that there is no political strategy, but there's a question, immediately there's a question, all this depressing, the stuff that Sonia was emphasizing, was noting. So let's turn this question on the head. Given that all of this stuff is going on, and given that the actors involved are not totally irrational, more or less a little bit, but not totally, what is the function of each party having the commitments that it does, pursuing the policies and practices that it does? And the function, I think, is very well, nicely captured by an interview that Dominique de Villepin, former Foreign Minister of France, pointed out, which is that, at least from the Israeli side, but I think that this also goes for the Hamas side, that the whole point of this strategy is to avoid putting a political solution on the table, right? So there's calculations of political survival that have to do with avoiding the political solution, gaining capital in one way or another from avoiding the political solution. Okay, certainly from the Israeli point of view, as Andrea Ruggeri was saying, there's absolutely no, it beggars belief, stretches credulity beyond the credulous, the plausible, that the strategy that they have been using will eliminate Hamas. And even if it does eliminate Hamas in the sense of the organization that we know it now, it's certainly, there is no rational expectation, there's no evidence that one can rationally expect the armed resistance as a strategy is somehow going to be reduced by the tactics being used, and I do mean tactics as opposed to strategy being used by the current Israeli government. I think I've dealt with everything. Oh, sorry, one very final thing. The commitment of the European Union to sort of a two-state solution, or of a long-term structural resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli question, has always been problematic. I think it's all been question marks about that, but Daniela will say more about those. I think what's interesting about the current context is that what we've seen in Europe is a crackdown against opposition or dissent against government lines, government and European lines, that is very much unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented, in terms of censorship, in terms of censorship within universities, at the cultural level, as well as at a kind of popular organizational level and so on. One of the novelties, however, alongside the unprecedented degree of repression and censorship, is that this time it also involves a new generation, both in the US and in Europe, of Jewish organizations and individuals, whether they're anti-Zionist or simply anti-Netanyahu or whatever. There's a vast range, right? There's a broad range of people, groups, and artists who are also being targeted in exactly the same terms and by exactly the same legal and sort of policing security instruments than the traditional historical pro-Palestinian groups in Europe itself. And that is extremely worrying.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Daniela.
Yes, thank you so much for a good question. So on the one-state solution, I think here I would like to add to what had already been said, that we have a one-state reality a lot already, in the sense that it is one actor that holds the monopoly of force in the whole area. And this happens, this evolution of this one-state reality happens under decades of peace processes. I don't think that the peace processes have pushed in that direction, but due to the lack of accountability, it is the reality as a result also of the peace processes. And I think after 50, I would say these peace processes start in 73 with the shuttle diplomacy of Kissinger, right? So I think we have to take stock and understand what we did until now has not worked. That's why I think we need a new paradigm. And if it then goes towards a two or a one-state solution, I think it's not up for us to decide. That's why I think there need to be elections. Palestinians need to have the right to vote for who will represent them, as Israelis do. And I think what the Europeans can do is to push in that direction, condition everything on international law, that any actor who is elected needs to respect international law. That needs to be the basic condition for all sides. And foster, I think, a general context which goes towards a logic of coexistence, which is entirely missing in the current framework. Now, to move more precisely to the European Union, and also the questions which Angela Romano has asked, thank you very much for this. I actually have written, I'm still working on it, a whole article in which I compare flagrant violations of international law, particularly of the Geneva Conventions, but not only, in the case of Russia in Ukraine and Israel in Palestine. And I look at how the EU has differently reacted in terms of accountability under international law to these flagrant violations of international law. And what you find is an enormous gap in terms of how the EU has responded. And I explained this in the second article by the logic of coloniality, whereby you see that the European response has this degree of coloniality still. It's very evident in the German approach, yeah. So where you see Germany, for example, votes against statehood in the General Assembly, but then at the ICC, it also argues, well, you cannot ask for an investigation into crimes because you're not a state. Yeah, so I mean, that coloniality is very self-evident in this approach, which also leads me to answering the questions of Emidio. I think that the perception in the Global South indeed is that this is an example of the European Union never really having decolonized. Yeah, and you can see also, I think you can see that logic of coloniality also in the crackdown within the European Union itself, that there are certain topics where there are limits to the freedom of speech. Yeah, so I mean, obviously for the Global South, there is more into this because it's that the West doesn't anymore sustain a rules-based order. And there is a chain in this, yeah? So, yeah, I hope this answers your question, Emidio. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Not only coloniality, when you were talking before of the Germany's position, also the legacy of collective memory and the link between memory and identity in the case of Germany, it seems to explain quite a lot. Andrea Ruggeri.
Yeah, we'll try very briefly to make a couple of points. So why so unique? I think now it's hard in terms of us as in academic work, but I think we can bring some hypotheses. The one is that I already mentioned, and Professor Sarto should mention, I mean, there has been a trauma within the Israeli society that I think we still have to gauge the dimension. I spoke with several persons working also on the security sector, analogies on other major factors. I don't like analogies, but I know the analogies are important for policymakers. Think about a 9/11 in Israeli history is something that can explain why there has been such a strong reaction. There is another aspect that is a more urban warfare tactical aspect. I mentioned Stephen Biddle and others. Clearly, Hamas has been used tactics to hide using underground tunnels, but also we know that the urban warfare is extremely hard, is extremely difficult, and it can lead to several traps. And IDF was aware, and this is why they use an extreme level of aerial force. And this is why I said policy rather than practice, because the policy, it means that there's been a table decision to tolerate a higher level of civilian casualties. The other aspect that we mentioned a couple of times, I think there is an important point about the role of Netanyahu and the fact that there is a logic of political survival from his perspective. And the longer the war, the higher probability it can stay in power, though we know that he has been extremely challenged. Another point that we mentioned, I think, is that there's been a failure. I would say, I use the term failure, not easily, by US and EU to pressure for restraint. The capacity to intervene by the US, I remember Blinken making a statement that seemed almost naive, where he said, it's maybe that we're killing too many civilians. I mean, that's not what we'd expect from a hegemon, even if it's the declining hegemon in terms of pressure to restrain an ally. And of course, this is talking about the US, but the European Union, I think, for several reasons. And I think one reason is that we thought that giving aid was enough to resolve the political aspect. So we believe that, you know, money was enough to resolve political issues. So I completely believe that, and I really like different ideas about the political strategy, because one big discussion is what's going to happen in the next future. What will be the political strategy, and what the European Union and the US are willing to accept, like occupation of Gaza or any other possible solution, will be important, not just for the future of Israel and the future of Palestinians, but also for the stability or instability of the Middle East. Thanks again for organizing this, Sonia and Emidio.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, for a closing remark, I would ask Emidio to, I don't see you anymore, Emidio. Okay.
Yes, that's him.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Sonia. It's very late, so let me say Thank you to all the speakers. And there is also an Q&A. It's very great. Thank you, Andrea, for answering to the last question. And this is the first webinar organized by Sonia and me for the Standing Group of International Relations. We are going to organize other things. So let me say really one word. I see online a friend of us, Sonia, it's Umberto Gori.
Yes, definitely.
And so I'm very happy. Umberto is really online and want to take the floor, or maybe not, maybe it's not the case. And so let me say really a great, it's a great honor to have him online with us today. So thank you. And bye.
Thank you very much. And I found the roundtable fascinating. I learned a lot, and I really wish to thank a lot all the speakers. It has been really very, very interesting. Thank you very much, and have a nice weekend. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.